You're listening to UMERADIO. I'm DJ Kelly, and this is UMERADIO Morning Show. And it's now time for us to go to the news, and of course, we begin with the New York Times. All the news that's fit to print. So that's what we're going to be doing now. I was just saying before, I just wanted to introduce it for those who are just joining us. You're listening to UMERADIO WMEDB New York. And I was just saying that migration is a topic, an issue that's top of mind for me, because this is how I see it, right? Travel and exposure oftentimes is what gets, especially people who grow up in economic situations that sometimes negatively impact our minds. We call it poverty, but what I call it is restrictions on resources, because God gave us everything. He created all we would need before He created us, right? So there should be no need for anyone to be in need, except that there are systems in place that create restrictions, and then I believe force people into lack. And so when I think of migration, just imagine being trapped somewhere and feeling as though you can't make it where you are. And so since God created the world, you're thinking, okay, I know there's a purpose for me to be born here, but at this point in time, there are limited opportunities here, or I don't feel safe here, or something is happening here that's causing me to feel I need to go. You should have the right to go somewhere else, right? And I understand God says we should obey the laws of the land, but those laws should never be oppressive, and it should never be unfair, and it should never be unequal, So migration is a topic that's top of mind for me. So every morning we look at some portion of migration trend. So after I go through the headlines on the New York Times, I'm going to look at some migration trends, and I feel for Nigeria right now. But I know Black people are resilient, so I know we're going to be okay. You know what I mean? But we need to really pay attention to what's happening. Because if we think it's only happening to a set of people, we're wrong. It's happening to us all. When one hurt, we all hurt. So we need to care. We have got to care, So, and then followed by migration trends, I'm going to share with you some statistics and trends that's happening in the consumer industry, in the business industry. If you're an entrepreneur or if you run a business, you need to know what's happening, especially in the digital world, because that is where, if you're not on a digital platform, if your business is not on mobile, if your business is not online, you're not going to become profitable, because that is where the retail industry is now. That's where business is heading now. So we share information with you so you can make informed decisions, okay? Because we're about inspiration and also empowerment. So that's why we do that. So I'm going to now go to the news. And let me just give this disclaimer. Sometimes the words, the names are new to me and difficult, and I'm not sure what the pronunciations are, but I try my best. So the New York Times front page, all the news that's fit to print. It's February 6, 2020. And in the weather, today will be mostly cloudy with periodic rain and a high 47. Tonight there will be heavy rain, sleet, and poor drainage, flooding, low 45. And for tomorrow, a bit of morning rain, high 50. And the weather map can be seen on page B12. Now, the first story on the front page, the headline reads, "Split Senate clears Trump on each count in finale of a bitter impeachment battle." That's the major headline, and you can see a photo below of President Trump at the back, and there is a military officer. Well, there are military officers around him, some saluting, some like they're going forward somewhere, or they're standing at attention or something. That's what it looks like. The subtext beneath that says, President Trump was acquitted on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress in nearly party line votes on Wednesday. Just be mindful that if you're speaking to me at this time, I won't be able to respond to you, but I will reply afterwards, okay? So the first story I'm going to read for you under the major headline, it says, country's victory, president says Democrats call trial a cover-up. And this story is by Nicholas Fandos, and it's out of Washington. After 5 months of hearings, investigations, and revelations about President Trump's dealings with Ukraine, a divided United States Senate acquitted him on Wednesday of charges that he abused his power and obstructed Congress to aid his own re-election, bringing an acrimonious impeachment trial to its expected end. In a pair of votes whose outcome was never in doubt, the Senate fell well short of the 2/3 margin that would have been needed to remove the 45th president. The verdicts came down after 3 weeks of debate, almost entirely along party lines, with every Democrat voting guilty on both charges and Republicans uniformly voting not guilty on the obstruction of Congress charge. Only one Republican, Senator Mitt Romney of Utah, broke with his party to judge Mr. Trump guilty as abuse of power. It was the third impeachment trial of a president and the third acquittal in American history, and it ended the way it began, with Republicans and Democrats at odds. They disagreed over Mr. Trump's conduct and his fitness for office, even as some members of his party conceded the basic allegations that undergirded the charges that he sought to pressure Ukraine to smear his political rivals. But in a sign of the widening partisan divide testing the country and its institutions, the verdict did not promise finality, which members of both parties conceded would come only after the November election. This story continues on page A11, and they have a graph here, Article 1, abuse of power. If all 100 senators are present, 67 votes are needed to convict. So it says here, for the total, for Democrats and Republican, for the first charge, that's for Article 1, abuse of power, they had 48 saying yes, 47 from the Democrats and 1 from Republican, equaling 48 says yes, 47 of those from Democrats and 1 from Republican, and 52 said no. And all 52 were Republicans. Article 2, obstruction of Congress. 47 voted yes, and 53 voted no. Okay. So I guess there what I'm saying is it Mitt Romney? Yeah, I think that's what it said, yeah. Let me make sure I'm saying the right thing. Yeah, Senator Mitt Romney, I guess he agreed to the abuse of power, that it was abuse of power, but he does not agree that there was obstruction of Congress. Okay, in another story, an act of defiance by Romney against the party he'd personified. And that story, of course that would make a story, is by Mark Leibovich. That's how I'm pronouncing it anyway. I'm sorry to him if I mispronounced. So this also is from Washington. Senator Mitt Romney of Utah never became president, but he earned a new distinction on Wednesday. He will be remembered as the first senator in American history to vote to remove a president of his own party from office. Mr. Romney, the 2012 Republican nominee for president, said he expected swift and extreme recrimination from his party for his solitary act of defiance. He was not incorrect. Donald Trump Jr., the president's oldest son, tweeted that Mr. Romney is, in quote, is forever bitter about losing the presidency and called for him to be, in quote, expelled from the Republican Party. Ronna McDaniel, Ronna McDaniel, Mr. Romney's niece and the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, said that the president had done nothing wrong. The party was, in quote, more united than ever behind him, end quote, and that this was not the first time she had disagreed with Mitt, end quote. And President Trump himself tweeted a video attacking Mr. Romney as a Democrat seeking asset. As, in quote, a Democrat secret asset. Wow. Shortly after 4 p.m. on Wednesday, Mr. Romney voted to convict Mr. Trump of abuse of power for his pressure campaign on Ukraine to investigate his political rivals, including former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. And here's a quote: attempting to corrupt an election to maintain power is about as egregious an assault on the Constitution as can be made, Mr. Romney said in an interview in his Senate office on Wednesday. And I think he said it well. Continued on page A12. Later today, I think it's 7 o'clock, I'm going to be going live with my show that I do on UMERADIO, Finding Happy. And I'm going to be talking about today, is there a place for not just free thinking, but unpopular thinking in a space where there may need to be a need for questioning? Because I think we have a culture. I'm not saying Senator Romney is right or wrong, or that the president was right or wrong. I'm saying, isn't there a space for disagreement anymore? And if there isn't a space for disagreement anymore, what are we saying exactly? What are we saying exactly? Are we soldiers of an army of the world where we should just all believe, think, and say and do the same thing no matter what? No matter what we feel about it, no matter whether it's wrong or right, and if you go against the grain, then you should be demolished, destroyed. You know, so it's something I really, really want to share my views on and talk about. And so if you're listening now and you'd like to join me later, please come back to Podbean, because I'll be live there, or as well as you can tune into UMERadio, because I'll be live there. The next headline says, once hopeful in GOP districts, resistors become the resisted. And the subtitle is, trying to dent support of Trump, they find a steel curtain. This story is by Campbell Robertson out of Washington. In the winter of 2018, Cindy Callahan knocked on doors, lots and lots of doors, and a new soldier in the sprawling ranks of the anti-Trump resistance. She spent her weekends in the small towns of southwestern Pennsylvania, telling strangers about Connor Lamb, the Democrat who was running for Congress in a district that President Trump carried by nearly 20% points. When Mr. Lamb won his special election in a narrow but stunning upset, it seemed that there was an opportunity, if enough people put in enough work, to change minds and thus change the country's politics. In quote, I felt like there was, Ms. Callahan said. Now, as she watches the Republicans' swift rebuff of impeachment charges, the meltdown of the Iowa caucuses, and the infighting among the supporters of various Democratic presidential candidates, she feels that less and less. Here's a quote: it doesn't matter. Find any kind of total corrupt thing that Trump did, and it doesn't matter, she said. Republicans are just unified. They're a damn steel curtain. I'm taking a break until this summer, she says. 3 years ago, when hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in protest of Mr. Trump, the resistance seemed immense. 2 years ago, when legions of canvassers and postcard writers helped flip dozens of congressional seats nationwide, it proved effective. Now, with the 2020 election approaching, the Democratic Party seems as disjointed as ever, while the Trump administration appears not only undismayed but emboldened. And veterans of the 4-year-old resistance, particularly in places where they remain outnumbered, are facing up to an unwelcome truth. This is going to be even harder than it once looked. That story continues on page A14. In other news, late start and missteps hobbled Biden in Iowa. There's a photo of Joseph R. Biden Jr. and the subtext says, in quote, "We took a gut punch in Iowa," and that's a quote by Mr. Biden himself. This article is by Katie Gluck, Jonathan Martin, and Thomas Kaplan. Maybe it was the threat of bad weather. Maybe it was a seating assignment debacle. Maybe it was a struggling campaign organization that still hadn't found its footing. But as Joseph R. Biden Jr. spoke at a major Iowa Democratic Party dinner in November, one thing was clear. His support appeared tepid compared with the vocal cheering sections of his biggest rivals. The reception angered Mr. Biden and his top aides, and it left little doubt about his standing 3 months before the nominating process in the Democratic presidential race would begin. The former vice president was in deep trouble in Iowa. 2 days after the dinner, Mr. Biden ripped into his campaign chairman, Steve Ricchetti, according to a person familiar with the conversation. And at the Biden headquarters in Philadelphia, senior officials sternly told staff members they needed to step up their performance. The dinner's damaging optics marked the beginning of a flurry of changes. Trusted aides were deployed to Iowa sooner than anticipated. Mr. Biden rescheduled time with donors to make space for a bus tour in Iowa. That story continues on page A16. In other stories, Kirk Douglas, 1916 to 2020, from Spartacus to Van Gogh, I think it is, leading man of a golden age. This story is by Robert Berkovist. Kirk Douglas, one of the last surviving movie stars from Hollywood's golden age, whose rugged good looks and muscular intensity made him a commanding presence in celebrated films like Lust for Life, Spartacus, and Paths of Glory, died on Wednesday at his home in Beverly Hills, California. He was 102. The actor Michael Douglas, one of his sons, announced the death in a statement on his Facebook page. Mr. Douglas had made a long and difficult recovery from the effects of a severe stroke he suffered in 1996. In 2011, cane in hand, he came on stage at the Academy Awards ceremony, good-naturedly flirted with the co-host Anne Hathaway, and jokingly stretched out his presentation of the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. By then, and even more so as he approached 100 and largely dropped out of sight, he was one of the last flickering stars in a Hollywood firmament that few of Hollywood's Kodak Theater on that Oscars evening could have known except through viewings of old movies now called classics. A vast number filling the hall had not even been born when he was at the screen star peak, the 1950s and 60s. This story continues on page A24, and there's a photo of Kirk Douglas back in 1974 that is also shared on the page. Condolences to his family and friends and the community that will miss him. In other headlines, we have Sports Thursday. Who needs a ski lift? Sharon Crawford, 75, a multi-sports athlete from Colorado, is still going against gravity and Against the Grain. And there's a photo, I assume, of Sharon Crawford skiing on the ice. Oh wow, at 75. That story is on page B7. Unrest in Red Sox Nation. By trading Mookie Betts, Boston has put a cost-conscious plan into action. Will fans tolerate a rebuild? That story is on page B7. And in national news, travel penalty for New York. The Trump administration froze New Yorkers out of programs allowing travelers to speed through airport lines in a dispute over immigration. There's those migration issues again. Page A19, that's on. And in international news, outbreak erases the calendar. In a metropolis under lockdown, the streets are quiet and one day is much like the last. Wuhan Dispatch, page A8. And another headline under international news, war with British press flares. Interesting. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is sparring with the BBC, drawing comparisons to President Trump. That story is on page A4. And in business news headlines, Netflix iffy Oscar night. The streaming giant spent millions to promote movie contenders, but forecasters do not expect it to win many Academy Awards on Sunday. Page B1. Facial recognition at school. A New York district's embrace of the technology as a safety tool is fueling a broad debate about privacy. Page B1. And in New York, a surprise end to broker fees. Regulators unexpectedly banned the fees, which can cost renters as much as 15% of an annual lease. And that ends our story. Our headlines for today. There is arts and styles, but that's it for today.